welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about how to automate cyber processes properly. So today is going to be about the design of processes to ensure that by the time you get to the automation stage, you're automating things that are already going well as opposed to amplifying efforts that are not already working properly. So manual cyber risk work becomes heavy very, very quickly. So as a small organization, you start off with a few cyber processes. They might not be executed perfectly each time, but because you're small or there's a small volume of processes or tasks to complete, it's not so much of a problem. But then all of a sudden, as a startup, you experience rapid growth. And then before you know it, that tiny problem snowballs into this massive thing that is really hard to control and really hard to correct. And then naturally, it's logical to say, oh, let's automate to benefit from the typical benefits of automation, assuming you've had the process designed properly. So this is like before you get to automating, how to make sure you've designed the process properly. So that could be to do with risk registers, evidence collection for audits. That's like a very common use case for automation. Control reviews, supplier risk assessments, access reviews, those sort of things. Things that when you have a small amount to do, it's not so bad, but the minute you scale up, it becomes quite onerous. So the problem is automating before you've designed the process. So the workflow is not the process. So what you see in whichever tool, that's not the process. That is a out-the-box configuration that you need to adapt to your organization or for your organization to align with. You can't just throw something into a tool and assume that it's going to work perfectly. So yeah, it's a representation of the process. If the trigger, intake, triage, ownership, evidence, escalation, and reporting are unclear, automation is not going to fix them. So I'm going to go back to an analogy I've used in the past. So imagine a restaurant that has really, really effective waiters, so they can get meals to the table really, really quickly. They can take orders really, really quickly. But then the kitchen itself, they don't have a good process for fulfilling the orders, for getting orders out in time, etc. No matter how good the waiter is, the waiter being the tool, the waiter representing the tool in this example, you're not going to get good results if you don't have a good back end, essentially. So your underlying processes, your organization, how they normally do things. So automation makes weak process design louder. So I'll give the perfect example to use is a GRC tool that sends reminders. So let's say it's sending a reminder related to collecting a piece of evidence for something, right? But in the system, you haven't specified the type of evidence you need to receive. You haven't been detailed about it. So the person receiving the notification doesn't really know what the ask is. They're not clear on what they need to send to you. So that's one side of things. And on top of that, each time, each, let's say, day that goes on, they receive a follow-up to say, you still haven't done this. And then eventually their manager also receives a message to say they haven't done this. So in the end, you've got a bunch of notifications being sent to someone, but the underlying principle, which is what they need to do, and if he's even the right person that's been the right person that has been nominated to complete this piece of work. If those two things are wrong, no matter how good the mechanism is for collecting evidence, it's not going to work in practice. So that's just a quick example. So design a process clear enough to automate. So if you design your process properly, that means that before you enter the tool, people are very clear on what needs to be done. So in terms of evidence collection, I'm going to stick with the example of evidence collection. Let's say for evidence collection, you have specified that you need 5 pieces of evidence from system A, B, C, D, E, and then you describe exactly what you want to see. So you need to see a configuration page of multi-factor authentication, or you need to see documentation that shows that policy A has been updated within the last 12 months. Whatever it is, you need to be very detailed. I would rather have 12 or 13 detailed bullets of what needs to be submitted as evidence than to have one overarching statement that may or may not be completed to the full extent. So I'll expand on that more. If you were to give a blanket statement that says you need to do, and then you name 3 or 4 things in there, if someone has part of the evidence, they'll submit it. And in terms of the system takes that as this task has been completed. But when you actually go in and look at the evidence provided, you might find they've only done part A or part B, compared to if you split it out and you do as many sub-controls as you need, you're sure that you've actually ticked off each individual thing. And then if there are any follow-up questions or escalation, or it needs to be broken down into, rather than one person being responsible, maybe 5 people are responsible, you've got that level of detail and you're able to see where things have broken down or where things have gone wrong. And then going back to like the chasing example of follow-up messages, if someone hasn't completed something, it's easier for you to chase up one specific person for a specific part of a task and their manager, as opposed to chasing one person, but really 12 people ultimately are responsible. So that's also something to think about. But yeah, the first step is always understanding the end-to-end process offline, like before you bring in any tools, before you add any speed to anything. So before you add any speed to the restaurant waitering system, make sure that everything is working properly to begin with. So process design comes before automation. So cyber risk automation should support the operating model. So it shouldn't be a case where you bring in a tool but you don't actually have an underlying process. It should always be process first, then technology. So step one, define the trigger. So every process has a clear starting point. So for example, the risk intake, when there's a new threat, a control gap, a finding, an incident, supplier concern, business change, something that starts the beginning of the process. Access risk, so for example, a change in your workforce, so whether someone is leaving, joining, changing roles, a privileged access request, or a failed review. Vendor risk, so supplier will access systems, data, or production service. Escalation and action is blocked, overdue, underfunded, or needs leadership decision. It needs to be clear where the process starts. So I like to start off with either a piece of paper or a whiteboard, whatever you have. So just have an idea of where this starts. And you can start thinking of who's also involved typically as well. And for each of these, for as many of these as you have, try to do it one by one. Don't try and take a blanket approach for everything, because sometimes there are deviations from how, let's say, a risk intake starts compared to a vendor risk. So just make sure you do them one by one. Invite the necessary stakeholders, or alternatively, you can start the sketch and then you can share it with them and ask if there's anything you've missed in your representation of the process. Next, design the intake. So this, I think, is one of the most important parts. So make sure that when you invite people to complete the process, you ask every single question that is necessary, so that you don't need to go. So for example, you start off with them, you ask them all the questions you need, and then you proceed forward to the next step. You don't want there to be like a loop where there's back and forth, need for clarification on every single occasion. Now and again, there's going to be some quite special circumstances or situations where you need to get that extra level of detail, but as a standard, the intake form should contain every single piece of information they need to be able to do their job. So make sure that once you've designed the form, you pilot it with people, like a small group of people, to make sure that, especially external to security, to make sure that people understand the form and it's not going to go into live and essentially fall flat, or people don't use it because it's not enough. So what happened? Capturing the event, the concern, the possible risk, where did it come from? This is very important, especially when it comes to reporting, understanding where things are coming from. Like, let's say you at the end of the year, you determine that 40% of your risks or whatever it is comes from a specific area. That can often indicate that there's something that needs to be changed or adjusted. So audit, incident, client, supplier, control review, or business change. What is affected? So understanding where specifically the potential issue could be. So system, supplier, process, team, data, or customer impact, and why it matters. So this is always going to be tied back to business impact. So how is it going to impact the business? Because remember, you're reporting to the C-suite, you're communicating to business leads, and they need to understand, in terms of our business, what does that mean for us? So don't think too much about the technical, think of how it actually impacts the business. So is that revenue loss? Is that regulatory pressure? Outline how that is impacting the business. Separate the type of entries. So the process depends on what type of thing it is. So there shouldn't be one blanket process for risks, issues, actions, and findings. That's too broad. You want to get very, very specific. So that's why in the previous step, I mentioned mapping out each journey separately to make sure that you're capturing everything in its totality. So for risk, assess, assign ownership, decide treatment, review. For issue, assign a fixed owner, track resolution. An action, assign a delivery owner, due date and escalation. And then for findings, track remediation, evidence, and closure. So again, make sure that you're defining the different intake forms or entries depending on the type of thing it is. Design triage. So not every entry goes straight into the risk register. So if you realize that it's like a true risk, add that to the risk register. If you realize it's a task, add it to your action tracker or action board or task board or ticketing system. Audit gap, that's your findings log, because historically it's good to have a history of your findings, so that if you're having recurring findings, it's easy to identify, and also for just keeping it separate. And then duplicate, if you find that it's already linked to something that already is in flight or already been recorded, then it makes sense to just place it with that rather than putting it in the risk register and just like creating like almost like a separate record for it. Number 5, design ownership. This is really, really important. So it's not just about saying someone owns it, but it's also about qualifying the person. So making sure that they're best equipped to make decisions in this area, that they're still with the business, that it's within their remit, and they're able to give you updates as and when is necessary. So risk owner, accountable for business risk and treatment decision. Action owner, responsible for completing the task. I'll give an example for action owners. Sometimes it's like a one-off action that needs to be done, and it's not necessarily, it's based on the domain that they work in. So it's important to just have someone that is an expert in that area to complete that. Control owner, responsible for operating and evidence in the control. Again, can be completely separate from the risk owner, so worth calling out. And then leadership owns acceptance, funding, trade-offs, and prioritization. All of these roles are important, and it's important to make sure that it's understood where each of these roles lie within the different types of things you found. And again, if it's not owned, then often it's not properly managed. So it's good to assign an actual owner, a named individual that will be responsible for the process. Design the action workflow. So actions need more than a due date. So an action description, so you know exactly what needs to be done. This becomes important when it comes to escalation. So if you find that an action is lapsing or it's not being worked on as you expect and you want to escalate it, it's important for the leader the leader responsible for escalation is able to look at the action and understand the actual ask, expected outcome, what this should look like. So again, just detailing what are you expecting in this circumstance, what is a completed or finished product, what does that look like? And then evidence requires. So it's sometimes not enough to just say I've changed configuration. Sometimes we need to see a screenshot of that configuration or whatever it is, just to show that it has been done, and that also supports the evidence library in the future as well. And then blocker route, what happens if I cannot move? So knowing the escalation route, so is it the CTO you need to go to? Is it the CISO? Is it head of IT? Understanding what needs to be done if the action is not completed. And just making sure that everyone knows the options available for things like this as well. Design evidence into this process. So this is in line with having rather than an audit chasing environment, an audit ready environment. So if you have a library that has been set up for this process already, it can be very simple. It can be within the GRC tool. It could just be a document library within SharePoint, Google Drive, etc. But just having a system for collecting evidence as a standard, so that at any given time, if you're asked for a piece of evidence, you either need to just refresh it, or you've got something that you've collected in the last 6 months or a time period that is acceptable. So evidence should be created as work happens. So using that same example of requiring a control effectiveness exercise to require evidence, or part of the process requiring evidence, it's about making sure that people have access to evidence without necessarily having to interact with someone or get a fresh piece of information if it's not necessary. So for example, access reviews, you should have a completed review. So once you've reached out to all the different managers, you should have a folder that contains all the information that you collected in that review, assuming you do it once a year, for example, for general access. And then a removal record, so again, that's a print screen of the ticket that shows removal or revocation of access. Approval records, so showing the workflow, showing the individuals that approved an access request, so like whether it's privileged, whether it's standard. Supplier reviews, so that's the questionnaires, the risk decisions, contract evidence, so showing the security schedule, showing what has been agreed, showing a due diligence exercise to make sure that people just to make sure that you can evidence that due care has been taken. Risk acceptance, owner, reason, expiry date, decision record, so making a note of the circumstances that led to risk acceptance, and if there's a deviation from risk appetite, making sure that it's evidenced properly in case anything happens. Incident process, so log, timeline, decision record, and lessons learned. Lessons learned being very important to make sure that in the future you're incorporating that into like any future process design or continuous improvement. And then just as like a final note, a process isn't properly designed if it doesn't consider the evidence you need later. So if you have to produce evidence separate to the process, then it's probably not very well designed, and it's also not sustainable when you start to grow as a business. Design escalation. So escalation should be part of the process. So you should always be considering that at the different milestones, depending on how urgent the task, the risk, the issue is, there should be like SLAs based on that. So overdue by 7 days, notify the action owner and process owner. You might decide to include looping a manager as well. So the line manager of the individual that should have taken the action. Overdue by 14 days, escalate to the risk owner. Critical treatment blocked, escalate to leadership review. So that could be your monthly meetings, your fortnightly meetings. Accepted risk expiring, escalate to accountable leader. With a lot of GRC tools as well, you can also get prior notification for accepted risk expiring. So you might say 30 days before you want to receive a notification to prompt you to take an action or prompt you to review whether you need to continue that acceptance or if you need to come up with a more enduring solution. But it should be within the actual process that you've designed to have a means of escalation appropriate for what the process is. So your process for escalating a risk versus an issue versus an audit finding, they should be similar. They can be similar, but they should all be separately considered to make sure that it's all encompassing. Design reporting around decisions. So reporting is an output of process design. So from the outset, you should be considering the information that you want to be able to present at a leadership level. So top risk is always going to be in there. Block treatments, because that indicates what needs escalating. Accepted risks, especially if they are coming up to expiry, that tells you what you need to review in terms of creating a long-term solution or extending the acceptance as well. Evidence gap, so what affects audit or client readiness. Those are really important because if you're trying to align with a standard, it can notify you of where you need to make sure that you provide evidence or refresh evidence. And then 10, decide what to automate. So you don't have to automate the entire process at once. You could decide that you're going to put one part of the process into the system and see how the organization copes. And then after you notice that it's going well, you can decide to automate the next part of the process. So for example, you can start off with the risk intake form. You can say, we're going to create an automation for this. And then once you refine that process, so people use the risk intake form, you find it's going really well, you can just say, okay, I'm going to add another element to this. So that means that rather than just that, you'll also collect updates through there. And then once that process goes well, so with everything, you want to make sure that it's a gradual thing. So automate, routing, reminders, escalation triggers, review cycles, meeting packs, and then keep human. So risk acceptance, you don't want it to be a case where a tool is deciding if it's acceptable for you to extend a risk acceptance or to lapse it or whatever it is. Business impact, those are things that you need to normally discuss at a leadership level, so those are good to keep offline. Treatment prioritization as well, that's very specific to an organization, so the average tool is not best equipped to do that. And then another thing you can automate are the evidence reminders, expiry alerts, dashboard refreshes. So anything that is time consuming and doesn't necessarily need anything that you can put a logic to, then you can go ahead and automate. But anything that requires human judgment, you should keep offline. But realistically, by the time you've automated all about the chases and things like that, you've bought back a lot of time, so you have time to spend on that. So for example, exception approval, sensitive incident, trade-off decision. So anything that requires discussion, debate, those are things that the tool almost brings to your attention and then you can take into meetings to discuss further. So I'm going to do a walkthrough of evidence collection process design. So the scenario is a growing SaaS company needs to prove that access to critical systems is reviewed regularly. The control says user access to critical systems is reviewed quarterly to confirm that access is appropriate, authorized, and still required. The company wants to automate evidence collection for this control. So the first thing is to define the trigger. So what starts the evidence collection process? So the evidence request should not start when the auditor asks for proof. It should start when the control is due to operate. So the trigger could be a quarterly access review window opens. So let's say the last one was in January. So as you get to like March, April, you should be aware that a new one is due. So a trigger rule could be every quarter an evidence request is created for each critical system owner. So that requires you to define the scope for that. So what are your critical systems? In this example, Google Workspace, GitHub, AWS, HubSpot, and Stripe. So the key point is in design is that triggers should be linked to the control cycle and not audit panic. So by that I mean that even if you have a audit due in July, you should already be doing the quarterly process. You should be in the organization should be in the habit of doing it anyway. So even pretend that they decide to cancel the week before, it should change nothing in real terms. If anything, it might mean you bring something forward. So let's say, using that same example of a control audit in January, and you know they're coming at the end of March, you might decide that I'm going to bring it forward just so that the evidence is fresher, as an example, if you so wish. For many auditors, it might be acceptable to have something that is following a structure as opposed to moving around with them. But again, it's up to you. But it should exist regardless of whether an auditor is coming in. 2, designing the intake. So what information is needed before the evidence request is sent? So before you ask someone for evidence, the process needs to have like enough context. So they need to look at the request that comes in and immediately understand what the ask is without coming back and forth to confirm. So the first maybe the first 1 or 2 times you do it, you might have a lot of like back and forth in terms of people understanding the ask. But the intake form should be designed such that it's very clear what is necessary. They know exactly what is required of them, and there's no real question about it really. So system name, system owners, review period, user list required, admin account. So listing each and everything you require to see in order for the evidence to be robust. And it's also considering the systems that you've asked for as well. So GitHub, so the stakeholders in this, or like systems involved, would be GitHub. The head of engineering needs to provide the evidence for the Q3 access review, and it's due on the 30th of September. So you know exactly what the process is. They know when it's due, and they know who's accountable for doing that, and the system as well. So the evidence required would be completed user access review, a removed user list, admin account confirmation, and reviewer approval. So this, if you have like a tool in place that automatically does this, you can show the report that you ran, the revocations you made, so the tickets showing you revoking access, manager input, so showing managers confirming access or requesting people to be removed, for example. So just showing the end-to-end process that you went through, and that was the outcome. And then a good design point would be good evidence collection, starting with a clear request. So rather than saying, I need you to review access, giving this level of detail here. So the intake field, being very detailed about each and every piece of evidence you need. Separate the entry type. What type of workflow is this? So this is not a new risk. This is evidence collection, an evidence collection workflow linked to an existing access control. So the entry type in this case would be evidence request, and then linked items, being detailed about what you actually need. So for example, quarterly access review control, unauthorized access risk, GitHub system owner, and access control evidence library category. And then key design point, the entry type determines the workflow. So back to that point of making sure that each workflow is very specific to the type of evidence you want or the type of process you're dealing with. And for this, I would say that it's quite overwhelming to overhaul everything at once. So start off with one process. So let's say risk, and then do the end-to-end process, design it, pilot it, and then do the same for the next process and the next. So rather than trying to do everything at once and rapidly trying to change everything at once, not only is that not sustainable, but it also can go wrong. And when you try to do too much too quickly, take your time. And then by the time you've done the first process and you've learned from that process, you can almost cascade the learnings to the other processes as well. So that's another benefit. Design triage. So should this evidence request continue, be changed or escalated? So before the request is sent, the process should check whether it is valid. So is the system still in scope? Is the owner still correct? Is this a duplicate request? Is the control due for review? Is the evidence standard clear? So having a look at this is quite important. So for example, if there's a system that's been decommissioned or if new systems have been added, you need to, before you send out the request, you need to evaluate if there have been any changes since the last review. And then in terms of ownership, you need to check it against your JML process to make sure that no one has like left or moved into another role, such that the owner has changed, because you want to make sure that the request is sent to the right person. If that means sending a quick message via Teams or Slack to just double check, again, for not for integrity, but just for making sure that you don't send the right thing to the wrong person, in terms of reputation. And then an example triage outcome. The GitHub access request is still valid, so we're still using GitHub. We still need to do the access request. The system is in scope, the owner is correct, and the quarterly review is due. So just those tiny things to just check off and make sure you're interacting in the right way and you don't irritate the business, essentially. And then the key design points is that if you triage, you're preventing duplication or sending unclear evidence requests, or just any scenario where you're going to send something to people that they're not going to understand, that could jeopardize future engagements that you have with people. Design ownership. Who owns each part of the evidence process? So evidence collection needs more than one owner field. So the ownership model is evidence owner, control owner, system owner, quality reviewer, escalation owner, evidence library owner. So as you're doing that design, almost mapping, like sketching out the process, have a look at the different people that need to be involved. Like have a column next to that to have almost like a stakeholder list to list at this stage. This is who we need, and then also think of the role that will be playing. You might find that there might be the same person performing multiple roles, but ultimately you need to be able to map out all the different stakeholders by process as well to make sure that, especially with escalation, you're considering the full cycle of this. Okay, and then an example of this is that the head of engineering produces the GitHub access request evidence. Security or GRC checks whether the evidence is complete and reusable. That's very, very important. So you need to make sure that it's not one thing to ask for the evidence and just know that it's been submitted by the tool or whichever platform you're using. It's important to make sure that the evidence meets the standard, and where it doesn't meet the standard, people are educated on how to meet the standard. So automation can route the request, but the ownership must be designed first. It has to be really, really clear who the stakeholders are. The tool can't help you with that. You need to have that by yourself. Design the action workflow. So what does that evidence owner need to do? The evidence request should clearly explain what done looks like. So if that means giving them an example or just being very detailed in describing what you need, expanding on this example, evidence owner action, complete the GitHub access request for the quarter, and then confirm active users, admin accounts, contractors, external collaborators, users who no longer need access, users removed during the review, and exceptions that need approval. And then upload completed access file, removal evidence, approval record, and exception list if applicable. It's very detailed in saying exactly what is expected in terms of evidence, and then it's telling them where that evidence needs to be supplied as well. So a key design point here is that a good workflow doesn't just say upload evidence, it tells the owner exactly what to produce. How you need to consider it is that if someone new joins the organization, it needs to be clear enough that someone, without looking at the previous year's evidence or the previous review cycle, can look at it, know exactly what's asked of them, and produce it with no questions. That's a measure of a good or well-designed workflow. And then design evidence into the process. So again, with the whole maintaining audit readiness, it should be very clear the evidence that needs to be created, and there should be a good system for storing the evidence as well. So evidence should be created as part of the review, not reconstructed later. It should be neatly laid out in folders or or within the system, however you choose to do it. It should be really easy to access, and it should be well labeled. So come up with a naming convention to make sure that it's easy to understand when it was captured, where it was captured, and what control it relates to. So required evidence, user access export, completed access review checklist, list of users removed, admin account review, contractor and external access review, and so forth. Evidence standard, so the evidence must show, and then it's outlining what specific or how specific it should be laid out. So what system was reviewed, what period was covered, what access was checked, what changes were made. Put yourself in the shoes of an auditor. For a piece of evidence to have almost validity, what does it need? So it needs to be dated, it needs to be, the scope needs to be understood, access needs to be understood, changes that were made needs to be clear as well. So if there's any corrective action, it needs to be taken, and then any corrective action that needs to be taken needs to be evidenced as well. So the key design point here is that evidence is only useful if it proves the control was operated. So if you look at a piece of evidence and standalone, it doesn't tell you enough to understand if it's working well or working consistently. Then it probably needs to be supplemented with something else to bring it to that standard. And then design escalation. So what happens if evidence is missing, late, or poor quality? So the process shouldn't just be about chasing people endlessly. There should be a graduated system. So in the first instance, it could be that you chase the individual, and then if a certain time period passes, that will be determined by organization. Let's say 5 days passed, you escalate to their manager. So you're chasing both the manager and the individual that needs to, the line manager and the individual that needs to do this work. And then after that, we escalate to the control owner. After that, we bring in, let's say, the CTO. And then after that, you can decide to take it to like board level or something like that, whatever makes sense for your organization. But it should be graduated. It shouldn't just be speaking to that individual. And as a personal note, it's always worth reaching out away from the tool just to double check there's nothing preventing them from doing that. But yeah, there should be a graduated escalation process. Incomplete evidence is returned to the owner with required fixes. So having understanding of what you require as well. So you know what the ask is, and being able to feed back to them and say, this is what's missing, or this is what needs to be done to meet the standard. And then critical access issues create an issue and escalation immediately. Exceptions are routed for risk acceptance or approval. So if you find that it's not actually possible for the control to be corrected, then taking appropriate action. And the key design point here is escalation should move blocked evidence to the right level before it becomes an audit problem. So it's not okay to wait for the external auditors to come in. We should have dealt with it prior to that. Design reporting around decisions. So what should leadership see? Evidence reporting shouldn't show only completion percentages. It should show whether evidence gaps create risk, audit, or client assurance problems. So it should be the so what about it. So it's not okay to just say that we completed 99%. That 1% could contain something that is an issue for the business. So making sure that when you do a report, you give that detailed breakdown. Give that detailed breakdown of what the actual findings were. And also the domain. So for example, if it's access reviews, configuration, make it very, very clear where the issues are coming from. So the report should show completed access reviews, overdue systems, rejected evidence, access issues found, exceptions needing approval, controls not evidenced, gaps affecting readiness, and decisions needed. So for example, if the GitHub access review is completed, but 2 contractor accounts required removal and 1 admin account exception needs approval, it should reflect that in the report. So even if you do correct it, you still need to give a summary of what happened, just so that it's understood how things generally happen, because that's helpful for process improvement. 10, decide what to automate. So what should be automated, what should stay human? So once you've actually established the process and it's working well, you should then kind of go into your same diagram and almost take a coloured pen and circle areas that have potentials to automate. So things that don't require any human judgment, or things that are repetitive, or things that don't necessarily require human intervention, you can go ahead and see if you can automate those sections of the process. So common ones are request creation, so the automated, like the cadence of requests, owner reminders, due date tracking, escalation triggers, missing evidence alerts, expiry dates, anything that is not necessarily, it doesn't require any skill to do. And then keep human, deciding whether access is appropriate, approving exceptions, accepting risk, judging evidence quality. Those are things where we need a human touch. So for someone to review and make a decision essentially. And then the key design point here is to automate the administration and keep the judgment human. So the end-to-end example summary. So we designed the evidence collection workflow. The quarterly access review window opens. An evidence request is created for each critical system. So that's once we've decided what's in scope. And then request is routed to the system owner. And then that owner reviews the users, admins, contractors, and external access. The owner removes access that's no longer required, and then they provide evidence of that full process. So who still has access, whose access was removed, and the process that was taken around that. And then security or GRC come in to check the quality of the evidence, and then the evidence is stored and tagged in the evidence library. So whether that's within the tool or within a library. And then if there's anything missing or there's poor evidence provided, then that's escalated via GRC and any elected escalation providers through the process. And then leadership sees the completion, the gaps, the exceptions, and decision needed. So the key takeaway here is that evidence collection works best when the process is designed end to end, and then automation is almost bolted on as like an afterthought, as opposed to the other way around. So it's not just about collecting files, it's about showing evidence that the control is actually working as you expect. So the final takeaway is not to automate chaos. Design the process first. So before you automate, design the process, test the process, pilot the process, and then incorporate anything you learn, and then go ahead and start using automations, whether that's tools or platforms, whatever it is. Make sure you've already designed it. So if you need support in designing your cyber risk process before you automate, feel free to book a consultation and we can have a discussion about your project. Thanks for watching.